Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and today I'm going to show you how to build this super easy Lazy Susan garage organization cabinet. So if you're like me, storage in the shop is always limited, but the main issue is that I'm just not very organized. So I built this Lazy Susan cabinet to help me keep some of my stuff that I normally just throw on the floor more organized, up off the floor and less sawdusty. So basically what I did was I built this rotating cabinet with shallow storage up top and then one large deeper storage box at the bottom. And then just so no surface of this build went to waste, I added some pegboard on one side of the cabinet for brooms and dustpans and such, whatever. And on the other side, I just put a large hook to hang my most used ladder and a couple of screws here to hang my levels. So anyway, if you're ready to get building and to get a little bit more organized, let's go. I've partnered with my friends at Kreg Tool and built something to provide you the free plans for this project that I'll link in the description below. This project is literally so easy and only takes a couple of hours to build. Unless you're like me and decide to paint some of it, then you have to wait for the paint to dry. The entire thing is built from 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood and a sheet of pegboard, which is optional. So as I always start out my plywood projects, I pulled out my circular saw and Kreg rip cut and began cutting down my sheets. Now, since this was just a shop project and not a piece of furniture, I went with sanded pine plywood for this versus the birch plywood that I normally use. This is definitely not as high of a quality, but it did save me a few bucks. I ripped 3 22-inch wide strips of plywood from my 2 sheets to use for the cabinet box. Then I adjusted my rip cut a 1/4 inch smaller and ripped another strip. I labeled this narrower piece because it will be used for the door and the shelving later. I set the leftover strips of plywood aside for now. I used my circular saw and AccuCut to cut a top, bottom, middle, and 2 side panels from the 22-inch wide strips. All the measurements are detailed in the plans linked below. I also cut a middle panel about 50 inches long to divide the top section into 2 shallower cabinets and a base plate to attach the Lazy Susan. Once the pieces were cut, I brought out my drill and Kreg pocket hole jig and began drilling pocket holes in the shelves and the middle divider panel to assemble the cabinet. For a little extra hold, I used some wood glue along with my pocket hole screws to assemble this cabinet carcass. I attached the top and the bottom pieces to one side panel and then added the middle divider. You could add the middle divider later, but I just thought it was easier at this point before adding the other side. This divider panel can technically go anywhere you want inside the cabinet, but I tried to just keep it centered between the front and the back edges. Before adding any screws, I did double check all of my measurements to make sure that the panel was the correct distance from the edge. Then I added the middle shelf, making sure to keep it square to the sides and the middle panel. Once everything was secure, I placed the other side of the cabinet on and glued and screwed it in place. Now the main carcass of the cabinet is assembled and all that's really left to do is add the door, shelves, and the Lazy Susan hardware. I cut the door first because I was planning to paint it and I wanted the paint to dry while I worked on the rest of the project. I pulled out the plywood strip that I cut earlier to be used for the door and trimmed a piece slightly smaller than the opening and test fit it. The remaining piece of plywood will be used as the shelves in a minute. Once I made sure that the door would fit, I painted it, which is a totally optional step. Honestly, I don't know why I painted any of this, but I was in the mood to add some color, so here we are. While that was drying, I moved on to adding the Lazy Susan. I cut a panel earlier to use as what we'll call base plate. I used a 12-inch diameter Lazy Susan rated for 1,000 pounds for this project, and I will link the one that I used below. I used a level to draw diagonal lines across this base plate and center the Lazy Susan on it. There are some large 3/4 inch diameter holes on the hardware that need to be drilled out on the base plate as access holes. Once the hardware was centered, I marked these holes and used a spade bit to drill them out. Then I placed the hardware back in the center and attached in place with 5/8 inch wood screws. I flipped the main cabinet upside down so that I could work on the bottom side, and then I climbed up on my workbench and set the base plate and hardware on top. I centered the base plate and screwed the hardware into the cabinet through the access holes that I drilled earlier. Then I flipped it back over and tested it out. Seems to work pretty well. At this point, I added some optional accessories, so you can add or skip this part as you need or wish. I wanted to add pegboard to the side of the cabinet to hang my brooms on, so I ripped a strip of pegboard that I've actually had in my shop for about 3 years, just trying to find some kind of use for it. Then I trimmed it to length to fit on the side of my cabinet. But if you've ever used pegboard before, you know that you can't mount the pegboard directly onto the side because you can't get the pegs in the holes. So remember those leftover plywood strips from the beginning? I ripped them in half, cut them to length, and then just screwed them on one side of the cabinet at the front and the back edges. Then I test fit the pegboard and decided to paint that as well. Again, I have no idea why I painted this, but whatever. At this point, I decided not to waste the little piece that I had cut off my pegboard strip, so I added it onto one of the cabinets as well. So much of this project is totally optional and customizable, so you can do or not do this part or any of the pegboard parts if you want. After letting the paint dry, I came back out and attached the pegboard to the strips that I installed using washer head screws to hold it in place. And before adding the door, I went ahead and drilled some shelf pin holes on both sides of the cabinet to install the adjustable shelves later. Before adding any more weight to this project, I went ahead and moved it where I wanted it in my shop, and then I used a concealed hinge jig to install concealed hinges for an inset door onto the door panel and screwed it into the cabinet. Adding the door is totally optional as well. I just wanted to hide all of my paint cans and block out a little bit of dust. You could leave the door off or actually install a door on both cabinets if you wanted. And finally, all that's left is the shelves. I used the remaining plywood from this project to cut down shelves for this cabinet. I added 3 shelves behind the door and 1 on the open side of the cabinet. I just cut these to width on the table saw and then trimmed them to length on the miter saw just to save some time. But you could also cut these down with a circular saw if you prefer. I used shelf pins in the shelf pin holes that I drilled earlier to place shelves on both sides of the cabinet. Then I loaded it up with paint cans, socket sets, tool bags, and other stuff that I just needed to find a good place for. I just added some screws on one side and a large hook to hang my ladder and levels, but you could also install pegboard on this side if you wanted. This is a really simple project that you can customize how you need for your own workspace or garage. I'm happy to have my toolboxes off the floor and my paint cans organized so I can actually see what I've got. So if you're looking for a little more organization and storage in your own workspace, I hope you enjoyed this project, and if you'd like to build one for yourself, be sure to head over and grab the plans linked in the description. And if you've enjoyed this video, I would love it if you would subscribe so you don't miss out on what's coming next. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!